Imagine waking up in the dead of night.
Oh, this is the worst feeling.
Right. Your bedroom is pitch black, but there's this smoke alarm just blaring right above your head.
At like 140 decibels.
Exactly. And your heart is pounding so hard it literally feels like it might crack your ribs. You're sweating through your sheets. Your breathing is super shallow and frantic. And every single cell in your body is screaming at you to just run for your life.
Because your body is convinced you are in mortal danger.
Yeah. But as you look around, there is no fire. There's no smoke. In fact, nothing is wrong at all. The only thing that happened is that somewhere, deep in the architecture of your brain, you merely thought about the possibility of someone burning toast.
And your body reacted as if the entire house was burning down to the ground.
Welcome to the Psychology Undergrad.
It is a terrifying scenario, but for millions of people, that internal false alarm is just, a daily reality. We are going to spend this session systematically unpacking the science of anxiety disorders.
Which is such a massive chapter in our abnormal psych text.
It really is. Our mission today is to figure out exactly where the line is drawn between normal, highly adaptive stress,
Yeah.
The kind of biological vigilance that keeps you alive when you're crossing a busy street, and a clinical anxiety disorder that just completely paralyzes you.
We want to equip you with some robust mental frameworks, a few mnemonic study hacks to help memorize all these diagnostic criteria, and ultimately a much deeper mechanical understanding of how the anxious mind actually works.
And if you are listening to this right now, consider yourself the third study buddy in the room with us.
Pull up a chair.
We are taking the primary research, the case studies, and the massive amount of clinical data on abnormal psychology, and we're just going to break it all together.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we get into the heavy clinical definitions and the neurobiology, we really have to talk about how staggering the prevalence of anxiety truly is.
It's everywhere.
Right. We aren't just memorizing abstract theories here for a midterm. We are studying the lived reality of the people sitting right next to us in the lecture hall.
That is exactly right. I mean, anxiety disorders are the most common psychological disorders globally. We are talking about roughly 1 in 5 people.
20% of the entire population.
Yeah, 20% meeting the criteria for an anxiety disorder at some point in their lives. And this cuts across every demographic, every level of success, and every socioeconomic status.
To put a face to those statistics, I want to look at Alan Rock. He's mentioned in the text.
Oh yeah, the former Minister of Health.
Yeah, and former president of the University of Ottawa. From the outside, you see this person of immense authority and capability. But he has spoken very openly about his own struggles with severe anxiety and debilitating panic attacks back when he was an undergrad.
Which had to be incredibly isolating.
Totally. He described how agonizing it was to try and seek help during a time when he didn't even have the vocabulary to explain what was happening to his body, let alone know where to turn for clinical support.
And we see that exact same internal battle in more recent examples, like Kate Waddingham. She's another university student whose story is deeply embedded in the current literature we're studying.
Her story is so heartbreaking, but so important.
It really is. She articulated something so fundamentally common, which is the sheer weight of the stigma. She was struggling with severe anxiety, but flat out refused to seek help because she felt profound embarrassment.
Like it was a personal flaw.
Exactly. She questioned whether her suffering was even a legitimate medical issue or just a personal failing on her part. And it actually took the tragic suicide of a close friend for her to make the incredibly brave decision to go public and seek treatment.
It just shows how isolating this condition is. I mean, your brain is actively telling you that you are in mortal danger, but society is basically telling you to just calm down and get over it.
Which is the least helpful thing you can say to an anxious person.
Literally.
Yeah.
So let's go back to that analogy we started with. We have the biological smoke alarm. Now, a smoke alarm is highly adaptive, right?
Sure, you need it.
If there is a literal fire, a real objective threat to your physical survival, you absolutely want that alarm blaring at maximum volume. Your sympathetic nervous system kicks in.
Adrenaline floods your veins.
Right. Blood rushes to your major muscle groups so you can run. Your pupils dilate so you can see the threat clearly in the dark. That is normal fear. That is evolution keeping you alive.
But with anxiety disorders, that exact same life-saving mechanism is malfunctioning. It is firing off a 4-alarm physiological response to a minor, ambiguous, or completely imagined threat.
It's actually a perfect metaphor because it highlights that the hardware isn't broken.
Right. The body is executing the fear response perfectly.
Exactly. It is the software, the threat detection system that is miscalibrated. But to truly understand how that software malfunctions, we have to define the fundamental anatomy of anxiety itself. How do clinicians actually break down this super complex human experience into measurable parts?
Right, so if you're taking notes right now, think of this as the PCB circuit of anxiety.
Oh, I like.
Yeah, this is the core memory tool for understanding the structure of fear. If the PCB circuit overloads, you cross the threshold into a clinical disorder. The P stands for physiological, the C stands for cognitive, and the B stands for behavioral.
The PCB circuit. Okay, let's examine how each of those three components operates mechanically speaking. The physiological component is that heightened level of autonomic arousal we just discussed.
And this isn't just feeling a little bit jumpy before a date.
No, this is your body physically preparing for war. It is the racing heart rate pumping oxygenated blood to your limbs, the rapid, shallow breathing, the dry mouth, because your digestive system has literally shut down to conserve energy,
Yeah.
and the intense muscle tension.
Then you have the C, the cognitive component. This is your mind's subjective interpretation of all that physical arousal in the environment around you.
It's the internal monologue.
Exactly. It is the worry, the relentless rumination, the brain obsessively running simulations of future catastrophes. It's that internal echoing voice that says, something terrible is about to happen, I am going to fail, and I will not be able to survive the fallout.
And finally, the B, the behavioral component. This is the action you take, or honestly, more accurately, the action you refuse to take in response to the physiological and cognitive overload.
In clinical terms, this almost always manifests as avoidance.
Right. It is skipping the exam, canceling the date,
Wait.
or relying on what we call safety behaviors. A safety behavior is essentially a crutch.
Like what?
Well, it might be drinking 3 beers before a social event just to numb the nervous system, or insisting on bringing a safe person, like a specific trusted friend, absolutely everywhere you go so you have an anchor if the panic sets in.
So the PCB circuit, physiological, cognitive, behavioral. Now, to see this circuit in action, let's look at something almost everyone listening to this has experienced at least once: test anxiety.
Oh, yeah. The ultimate college experience.
Yeah. Researchers actually use test anxiety as the ultimate prototype for understanding how this circuit overloads. If we look at Saracen's reactions to test scale from the reading, we see that the cognitive side of anxiety actually splits into two very distinct subcategories.
Okay, what are they?
You have standard worry, which is consciously stressing over the grade, the GPA, the consequences of failing the class. But then you have this insidious second category called test-irrelevant thinking.
This is a crucial distinction. Test-irrelevant thinking is when your mind involuntarily wanders away from the exam entirely because the cognitive load of the stress is just too high to bear.
Right, you are staring at a complex, multiple-choice question, the clock is ticking, and suddenly you find yourself vividly imagining what you were going to eat for dinner, or replaying a random conversation you had with a barista 3 days ago.
Yes. You feel like you're just losing focus or getting distracted, but it's actually your brain desperately trying to execute an escape plan.
It really is.
The test-irrelevant thinking is literally an avoidance behavior manifesting entirely inside your own cognition. Your brain is saying, this threat is too massive, let's look anywhere else.
And what the research reveals about test anxiety is profound because it exposes the root cause of so many other anxieties. According to the data, at the very core of severe test anxiety is a profound sense of the self as deficient and powerless.
Wow.
Yeah. The student doesn't just think the test is hard, they deeply believe they are fundamentally incapable of controlling the outcome.
What's fascinating here is how the demographic data reflects the sheer scale of these feelings of powerlessness. If we look at the Kessler survey data, which is this massive epidemiological study mapping out the lifetime morbid risk for various conditions, we see some truly striking numbers.
Oh, the morbid risk stats are wild.
They really are. Specific phobias actually top the list of anxiety disorders, with an 18.4% lifetime morbid risk. Social anxiety disorder follows really closely behind at 13%.
Wait, almost 1 in 5 people will meet the clinical criteria for a specific phobia in their lifetime. That is massive.
It is. And the data also reveals a very stark gender divide. When we look at the Ontario Mental Health Supplement study, we see that in the preceding year, 16% of women suffered from an anxiety disorder compared to only 9% of men.
We also see highly distinct patterns in the age of onset.
Yeah, phobias, both specific and social, tend to hit very early in human development, typically presenting with a median onset between 15 and 17 years of age. But panic disorder and generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, have a much later developmental trajectory.
Those usually strike with a median onset between 23 and 30 years old, basically right when people are dealing with the massive life transitions of their 20s.
Exactly. Okay, so looking at those super high prevalence numbers, I want to bring up a huge philosophical debate that happened during the creation of the DSM-5.
I know exactly what you're going to bring up.
There was this strong movement to substantially lower the number of diagnostic symptoms required to officially diagnose someone with generalized anxiety disorder.
Right, they wanted to make it easier to get the diagnosis.
Yeah, and they ultimately voted against it. But it brings up a massive question. If clinicians continuously lower the threshold for what constitutes a disorder, aren't we just pathologizing normal, everyday human struggle?
That's a huge criticism of modern psychiatry.
Because life is inherently stressful, bills are stressful, the future is uncertain. Do we have a moral obligation, or at least a psychological duty, to allow people to feel natural existential dread without immediately slapping a medical label on them and saying their brain is broken?
That is the perpetual ethical tension at the heart of abnormal psychology. Where exactly is the boundary between inherent human suffering and clinical pathology?
Where is the line?
The dividing line, from a rigorous clinical perspective, hinges entirely on the subjectivity of impairment. It is not just about the presence of worry or dread. It is about chronic, intense distress that actively destroys a person's ability to function in their life roles.
Oh, I see.
Can they maintain employment? Can they attend classes? Can they sustain interpersonal relationships? If the answer is no, the threshold into pathology have been officially crossed.
So it's not the fact that you feel the fear, it's the paralysis that the fear causes.
Precisely. And it is deeply tied to the context of the environment. As we established, it is highly adaptive to feel anxious when there is an objective, measurable threat. But the chronically anxious mind perceives a lethal threat when the environment is completely ambiguous or even demonstrably neutral.
Like the Kraske study.
Yes. Consider the brilliant longitudinal study by Kraske and her colleagues. They placed adolescents in a controlled experimental environment and measured their physiological startle responses to various stimuli.
And the key to this was the safety cue, right?
Exactly. Crucially, they introduced a safety cue, a specific signal that explicitly guaranteed to the participant that absolutely no aversive stimulus would follow.
So they logically knew they were perfectly safe.
Right. And the study found that the adolescents who still exhibited a massive physical startle response, even in the direct presence of that safety cue, were the most likely to go on to develop a full-blown anxiety disorder later in life.
Because they literally lacked the cognitive mechanism to process safety. The smoke alarm is going off, the room is totally clear, someone is standing there holding up a sign saying there is no fire, and their body still braces for the flames anyway.
It's a fundamental misreading of the environment.
Which actually leads us perfectly into our next major category. Because if general anxiety is a malfunctioning smoke alarm that just rings constantly in the background, a specific phobia is a smoke alarm that only goes off when it sees a very specific, totally harmless object.
Let's break down specific phobias.
A specific phobia is clinically defined as an unwarranted fear caused by the presence, or even just the anticipation of a specific object or situation.
The fear is entirely out of proportion to any actual objective danger. And what makes it so agonizing for the sufferer is that they usually possess total intellectual insight.
Meaning they know it's silly.
Exactly. They know their fear is groundless and irrational. But that logical knowledge does absolutely nothing to stop the intense physiological distress and the extreme avoidance behaviors.
To help you memorize the DSM-5 subtypes of specific phobias for your exam, we have another memory tool. Think of the acronym BSANO. BSANO. Let's go through the letters.
The B stands for blood injection injury. This is a highly unique phobia class that includes seeing blood, receiving a hypodermic needle, or undergoing dental procedures.
Which operates super differently biologically, but we'll get to that later.
You will. The S stands for situations. This encompasses the fear of enclosed spaces, riding in elevators, or flying in commercial airplanes.
The A is for animals. This is where you find your classic fears of spiders, snakes, dogs, or insects. The N represents the natural environment. This includes a terror of heights, intense storms, or deep water.
And finally, the O is for other. This is the diagnostic catch-all for highly specific fears that just don't fit the previous categories. Things like the fear of choking, the fear of vomiting, or famously, the fear of clowns.
BSANO. Blood, situations, animals, natural environment, other. Now, it is important to understand that phobias are not just static relics of our evolutionary past. They evolve right alongside our society and our technology.
Oh, absolutely.
The literature points out a relatively new, distinctly modern phobia called nomophobia. Have you heard of
I
that?
have, yeah. It stands for no mobile phone phobia.
Right. It is the extreme pathological panic of being without a cellular device. And researchers really dug into this and found it isn't just a shallow addiction to scrolling social media. It stems from a deep, almost existential inability to communicate.
It is the terror of being severed from your social network.
And fundamentally, losing that literal lifeline to emergency services. In the modern world, the smartphone has literally transformed into a clinical safety behavior.
It is a modern manifestation of a very ancient attachment mechanism. But this raises the critical question of etiology. Why do we acquire these specific phobias in the first place? How does a harmless object become a trigger for terror?
The dominant framework for understanding this is the behavioral model, specifically Mohr's two-factor avoidance conditioning model.
This is classic psychology, but seeing how it builds a phobia step by step is fascinating. Step 1 of Mohr's model is classical conditioning. This creates the initial fear.
Let's give an example. Say you are a child and you see a completely neutral stimulus, like a dog. You have no fear of it. Suddenly, the dog barks aggressively and bites you, causing immense pain and terror.
Through classical conditioning, your brain pairs the neutral stimulus, the dog, with the terrifying event, the pain. Now, the mere sight of any dog instantly triggers the fear response.
But classical conditioning alone doesn't explain why the fear persists for decades, right? Like, why doesn't it just fade away?
That is where step 2 comes in, operant conditioning. This is what maintains the phobia over time. Because you are now terrified of dogs, every single time you see one, you immediately run away or cross the street.
You avoid it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that action of running away instantly removes the anxiety. The sudden relief feels so profoundly good to your nervous system that it negatively reinforces the avoidance behavior.
Because you always escape, you never allow your brain the opportunity to learn that 99% of dogs are actually completely safe and friendly. The avoidance locks the phobia into a permanent neurological loop.
It's a perfect behavioral trap. But historically, how psychologists interpreted this conditioning mechanism has varied wildly, and it led to some of the most famous and controversial debates in the history of psychology.
Oh, yes. If we look at the battle of the psychological paradigms, we see two entirely different interpretations of how fear is constructed. We can start with the behavioral extreme. John B. Watson's infamous Little Albert experiment from the 1920s.
This experiment is so wild and completely unethical by today's standards.
Oh, totally unethical. So Watson takes an infant, known as Little Albert, who had no pre-existing fears. He was just a calm baby. He placed a tame white laboratory rat in front of the baby. Albert was curious and tried to pet it.
Because it's just a soft little animal.
Right, but the exact moment Albert touched the rat, Watson struck a massive metal bar with a hammer right behind the baby's head, creating a terrifying, deafening noise.
Just brutal.
And he did this repeatedly. Eventually, Albert became hysterically terrified at the mere sight of the white rat, even without the noise. The behaviorists pointed to this and basically declared victory. They said, look, fear has no deep hidden meaning. It is just mechanical conditioned learning, stimulus and response.
But then you contrast that purely mechanical view with the psychoanalytic paradigm pioneered by Sigmund Freud.
Freud's take is always a trip.
It really is. Freud analyzed a remarkably similar outcome, a child with the specific phobia, but arrived at an entirely different universe of meaning. This is the famous case study of little Hans.
Right. Hans was a young boy who developed a paralyzing phobia of horses. He literally refused to go outside because he was terrified a horse would bite him or collapse in the street.
And Freud completely ignored the mechanics of conditioning. He didn't care if Hans had been startled by a horse in the past. Freud believed the phobia was just a surface-level symptom of a deep, unconscious symbolic conflict.
It's all about the symbols for Freud.
Always. Hans had mentioned that he was specifically afraid of the black blinders around the horse's eyes and the dark areas around their mouths. Freud interpreted the horse not as an animal, but as a direct symbol for Hans's father, who wore eyeglasses and had a thick black mustache.
I mean, the leap in logic is just incredible.
According to Freud's framework, Hans was experiencing intense, repressed edible anxiety, an unconscious fear of castration and moral retribution from his father. But because it was too psychologically devastating to consciously fear his own father, Hans's ego utilized the defense mechanism of displacement.
It projected all of that deep interpersonal and moral terror onto an external, avoidable object, the horse.
Exactly. The contrast is just incredible. The behaviorists look at fear and only care about its function, the mechanics of how it was acquired. The psychoanalysts look at fear and only care about its moral and symbolic content, what it represents in the dark corners of the unconscious mind.
While the psychoanalytic interpretation of phobias is largely dismissed in modern clinical practice, the debate really highlights the sheer complexity of human fear. It isn't just a blank slate of conditioning.
No, there is a profound biological variable at play here, a concept known as prepared learning. You have to ask yourself a logical question. If fear is just conditioning, why is it so incredibly easy to develop a phobia of spiders, snakes, or heights?
But almost mathematically impossible to develop a phobia of a lamb, a flower, or a toaster, even if you try to condition it in a lab.
Exactly.
Because evolution stacked the deck. Our ancient ancestors who were genetically predisposed to fear venomous snakes and avoid steep cliffs survived long enough to pass on their genes.
Our ancestors who were terrified of flowers but tried to pet the snakes, well, they didn't make it into the gene pool.
No, they did not. We are biologically prepared to fear specific ancient threats.
And this evolutionary hardwiring was beautifully demonstrated by researchers Cook and Manica in their landmark studies with rhesus monkeys.
Oh, this study's so cool.
They took groups of monkeys raised in captivity who had never seen snakes or crocodiles and had absolutely no pre-existing fears. They were completely naive to these predators.
And they showed these naive monkeys video footage of a demonstrator monkey reacting with absolute hysterical terror to 4 different objects. A toy snake, a toy crocodile, a bunch of flowers, and a toy rabbit.
The naive monkeys watched the video, and they immediately acquired an intense fear of the toy snake and the toy crocodile, simply through observational learning.
But, and this is the incredible part, they absolutely did not acquire any fear of the flowers or the toy rabbit, despite witnessing the exact same level of terror from the demonstrator monkey on the video.
Their neural architecture was biologically primed by evolution to instantly associate the reptilian shapes with mortal danger, but it actively resisted associating the flowers with danger. It is hardwired survival geometry.
But what is perhaps even more fascinating than biological hardwiring is cultural hardwiring. How do a culture's specific morals, religious beliefs, and philosophical frameworks directly dictate the target of our deepest anxieties?
This is where abnormal psychology meets anthropology. The literature provides a stunning example of this with a highly specific cross-cultural phobia documented in China known as palang.
Palang translates to the intense pathological fear of the cold, right?
Yes, we are talking about individuals who will wear multiple heavy winter coats, scarves, and gloves in the sweltering heat of summer because they are absolutely terrified that any loss of body heat will be immediately life-threatening.
And if you look at this through a purely Western biological lens, it seems entirely bizarre. Like, why are you wearing a parka in July? But when you apply the cultural and moral lens of ancient Chinese philosophy, it makes perfect logical sense.
Palang is directly linked to the philosophy of yin and yang. Within this deeply held belief system, yin represents the cold, the wind, the dark, and the passive energy-sapping elements of the universe.
While yang represents the hot, powerful, active, life-giving forces.
Right. So to a person suffering from palang, losing body heat isn't just a matter of feeling chilly. To succumb to the cold is to succumb to yin. It is the literal draining of your vital life energy.
The phobia is a direct physical manifestation of their philosophical and spiritual belief system. The cultural framework provides the exact target for the neurological fear response.
It perfectly illustrates how our specific phobias are a complex, interactive cocktail of evolutionary biology, behavioral conditioning, and cultural morality, which actually provides a seamless transition to our next major diagnostic category.
Because it is one thing to fear an ancient evolutionary threat like a snake, or an environmental element like the cold. But what happens when the phobic object, the terrifying stimulus that triggers the alarm, is other human beings?
That brings us to social anxiety disorder, or SAD. We defined SAD as a persistent, irrational, and overwhelming fear of being negatively evaluated, judged, or scrutinized by other people.
It is the absolute terror that you are going to reveal physical signs of your anxiety, like your hands shaking, your voice cracking, or your face blushing, and that you will behave in a way that is profoundly humiliating and socially devastating.
The DSM-5 essentially categorizes the feared situations in social anxiety disorder into 3 main domains. First, there are public speaking or performance situations, such as giving a presentation in a seminar or performing a piano recital.
Which makes sense. Everyone hates public speaking.
Right. But this is pathological fear. Second, there are unstructured social interactions, like trying to make small talk at a crowded party, or even just asking a store clerk a basic question.
And third, there is the fear of simply being observed in public, such as eating a meal in a restaurant or filling out paperwork while someone happens to be standing nearby.
And it is worth noting that the DSM-5 actually includes a specific performance-only specifier. This is for individuals whose intense, paralyzing fear is strictly limited to speaking or performing in front of an audience, but who are otherwise perfectly comfortable in casual social interactions.
It appears to be a distinct, specialized subtype of the disorder, but the devastating impact this disorder has on an individual's life trajectory cannot be overstated. It dictates what careers they choose, who they marry, and how they navigate every single day.
If you look at the real-world examples in the text, it really shatters the illusion that this only affects people who are naturally introverted or isolated.
Look at Jennifer Lawrence.
Yeah, the Academy Award-winning actress.
She is universally beloved for her seemingly effortless, outgoing personality, but she has spoken about suffering from crippling social anxiety as a child. She dreaded recess, she dreaded field trips, and she constantly felt stupid and inadequate among her peers.
She actually credited the mechanics of acting, the ability to put on a scripted alternative persona, with helping her survive and cope with the disorder.
Or consider the case of Ricky Williams, the phenomenally talented professional football player. He struggled with such intense, unmanageable social anxiety disorder that he resorted to using cannabis extensively as a clinical safety behavior.
He was essentially self-medicating just to neurologically survive the anticipatory anxiety of having to interact with the press and the public after a game.
And closer to home, the literature mentions a case study of a fourth-year university student enrolled in a mandatory seminar class. She had such severe SAD that she physically could not present her research to her peers.
She bravely agreed to fulfill the requirement, but only under one extraordinary condition, right?
Yeah. The entire class, including the professor, had to physically turn their chairs around and face the back wall so that absolutely no one was looking at her. She delivered her entire academic presentation to the backs of everyone's heads.
But try to conceptualize the sheer level of psychological terror a person must be experiencing to ask an entire room of their academic peers and their professor to turn their backs. That is not mere shyness. That is a paralyzing clinical condition.
So we must ask the etiology question again. How does the cognitive machinery of social anxiety disorder actually operate?
The most robust framework we have is David Clarke's cognitive model. Clarke's model is brilliant because it explains the exact mechanics of the cognitive malfunction. According to Clarke, people with SAD possess 3 distinct cognitive characteristics that trap them in the anxiety loop.
First, they have a massive, almost magnetic attentional bias toward negative social information.
Imagine looking at an audience of 50 people. 49 of them are smiling and nodding along with you. One person in the back row happens to check their watch or yawn.
A person with SA will completely filter out the 49 smiling faces. Their brain locks onto that single yawn like a laser-guided missile, interpreting it as undeniable, catastrophic proof of their social failure.
Second, they hold impossibly perfectionistic standards for their own social performance. They believe they must be endlessly witty, perfectly articulate, and completely devoid of any awkwardness, or else they will be rejected entirely.
And third, and perhaps most destructively, they suffer from a paralyzing degree of public self-consciousness. They are constantly monitoring their own behavior from an imagined, highly critical third-person perspective.
They are literally observing themselves from the outside in, assuming everyone else sees them as awkward, sweating, and inadequate.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the anxiety doesn't end when the social event ends. The literature introduces this brutal concept called post-event processing, or PP.
I like to think of it as a severe social hangover.
That's the perfect term for it. Let's say a socially anxious person manages to attend a dinner party. They survive it, they go home. But instead of feeling relief and going to sleep, they lie awake in bed for hours, obsessively ruminating and replaying every single micro-interaction of the night.
Why did I use that word? Did they notice my hand shaking when I held my glass? I totally laughed a second too late at that joke.
They process the event over and over and over, dwelling entirely on perceived negative responses.
And the research demonstrates that this post-event processing actually degrades their performance in the next social situation. The memory is encoded with so much shame and failure that they carry that heavy cognitive baggage into the future, making the next interaction even more terrifying.
I have a pushback question here, though, something I've always wondered about this. Are socially anxious people actually fundamentally bad at socializing?
What do you mean?
Like, do they actually possess a measurable social skills deficit because they've avoided interacting with people for so many years? Or is the intense anxiety just masking the perfectly fine interpersonal skills they already possess?
That is a heavily debated and researched question in the literature. Historically, early behavioral models simply assumed it was a lack of skills, that they never learned how to socialize properly.
And does the data support that?
Well, it is true that in clinical observation, socially anxious people are frequently rated lower in social competence by independent observers. However, recent, more nuanced data flips this entirely on its head.
How so?
The data suggests that the safety behaviors they rely on to cope with the physiological terror, things like actively avoiding eye contact, rushing through their sentences, keeping their arms rigidly crossed, or speaking in a monotone voice to avoid drawing attention, these exact defensive actions are precisely what cause observers to give them poor performance ratings.
Because they come off as aloof or weird.
Right. When therapists work with them to strip away the safety behaviors, their actual underlying interpersonal and conversational skills are often completely adequate, if not excellent. The anxiety is a thick fog obscuring their capability. They do not lack the capability itself.
That is deeply tragic, honestly. The exact defensive mechanisms they use to protect themselves from judgment are the very things that create the awkwardness they fear. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It truly is.
Now, earlier we talked about how cultural morality shapes specific phobias like pulling. I want to look at the philosophy and morality connection regarding social anxiety disorder. How does Western SAD compare to the fascinating Japanese syndrome called Taijin Kyofusho, or TKS?
This is arguably one of the most compelling cross-cultural comparisons in all of abnormal psychology. In Western cultures, the core thematic fear of social anxiety disorder is inherently self-focused.
The internal monologue is, I am terrified that I will be judged negatively by others. I am afraid of looking foolish. I am afraid of damaging my own reputation.
It is fundamentally about protecting the individual ego from embarrassment.
But in Japan, Taijin Kyofusho operates with almost the exact opposite moral architecture. TKS is the extreme, paralyzing fear of embarrassing, offending, or causing anxiety to other people.
A person suffering from TKS isn't primarily afraid that they look foolish. They're absolutely terrified that their own physical presence, their blushing, their body odor, a weird facial expression they might make, or an inappropriate glance, will offend the people around them and disrupt the social harmony of the group.
And this psychological manifestation stems directly from traditional Japanese cultural and moral values. Japanese society has historically prioritized the feelings, cohesion, and harmony of the collective group far above the desires or ego of the individual.
Furthermore, their cultural etiquette strongly discourages the direct, blunt expression of negative feelings. Therefore, the anxiety disorder manifests as a perceived failure to uphold a vital moral duty to the community.
It is a profound, almost altruistic terror, the fear of being a burden, a disruption, or an offense to the collective.
It is incredible. It perfectly illustrates how our deepest, most pathological anxieties are often just a dark, distorted mirror reflecting our society's deepest moral values.
In the West, we culturally worship individual success, autonomy, and self-esteem, so our anxiety disorder focuses on the fear of individual failure and judgment. In Japan, they culturally value group harmony and collective respect, so their anxiety disorder focuses on the fear of disrupting that harmony.
A brilliant synthesis of the concepts. Now, let us move from fears triggered by specific objects and fears triggered by social evaluation to an entirely different and more chaotic beast.
If social anxiety is a fear triggered by the presence of people, what happens when a terrifying, catastrophic physiological response is triggered by seemingly nothing at all?
Welcome to the fear of fear itself. Let's define panic disorder. It is characterized by recurrent, sudden, and completely inexplicable panic attacks.
We are talking about an explosive cascade of jarring physical symptoms that peak within minutes. Labored breathing, violent heart palpitations, sharp chest pain, profound dizziness, numbness, and sweating.
But the cognitive symptoms are what make it truly nightmarish. The literature highlights two specific, deeply unsettling feelings that often accompany severe panic: depersonalization and derealization.
These are profound cognitive distortions. Depersonalization is the visceral sensation of being detached from your own body or mental processes. Patients describe it as suddenly floating above themselves, watching their own body behave from afar as if they are a stranger to themselves.
And derealization is the sudden, terrifying feeling that the external world is no longer real. The room might suddenly look two-dimensional, artificial, or like a stage set.
Imagine standing in your kitchen, making a cup of coffee, and suddenly the walls look fake, you can't feel your own hands, and your heart is beating at 180 beats per minute.
It is no wonder people feel an intense terror, a sense of impending doom, and a genuine logical belief that they are fundamentally losing their minds, completely losing control, or literally experiencing a fatal heart attack.
And when those unexpected attacks happen repeatedly, they almost inevitably lead to the development of a secondary condition, agoraphobia.
The term comes from the Greek word agora, meaning the public square or marketplace. It is a complex cluster of fears centered on being in public places or situations where escape might be physically difficult, socially embarrassing, or where medical help might not be readily available if a panic attack occurs.
The primary text shares a heartbreaking real-world case study of Margot Paul, a First Nations woman from Lennox Island. When she was just 11 years old, she was violently assaulted. Following that profound trauma, she developed extreme, unrelenting agoraphobia.
She became absolutely terrified of leaving the physical confines of her house. Her home became her only neurologically acceptable safety zone.
She hid from the world for decades. Even in her 80s, she still rarely went outside, relying entirely on one of her sons, who acted as her clinical safe person, to take her grocery shopping once a week. She lived a life completely and utterly debilitated by the fear of her own panic response.
It is a devastating portrait of the disorder. She was quoted as saying, "My life is a sad, sad story." To live your entire existence in a self-imposed physical prison, not because you are afraid of monsters or criminals, but because your own autonomic nervous system's alarm system is constantly betraying you.
This begs the ultimate mechanistic question. How does the biology of this even work?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the biological etiology of panic disorder is intensely complex and deeply rooted in our neurochemistry. Genetically, researchers have focused heavily on the TOMT gene and its specific variations that seem to predispose individuals to panic.
And neurobiologically, there is a prominent theory of extreme overactivity in the noradrenergic system, specifically focusing on a tiny, densely packed nucleus of neurons in the pons of the brainstem called the locus ceruleus.
But the locus ceruleus is essentially the brain's central dispatch center for norepinephrine, which is a major catalyst for the fight-or-flight response. When it misfires, it floods the system with alarm signals.
But the text also details an experiment regarding a peptide called CCK4 that absolutely blew my mind.
Oh, this study is crazy.
Researchers wanted to understand the chemical triggers of panic, so they literally took healthy, non-anxious human volunteers and injected them intravenously with the CCK4 peptide.
And what happened?
It induced immediate, full-blown, terrifying panic attacks in these perfectly healthy individuals within seconds. And when they mapped their brain activity using neuroimaging during the injection, they saw a massive fiery activation in the amygdala, which is the brain's primal fear center.
That experiment proves undeniably that there are deeply rooted, fundamental biological and chemical triggers that can instantly initiate the panic sequence, entirely bypassing conscious thought or environmental threat.
But biology alone doesn't explain the full disorder, right? Because everyone's heart beats fast sometimes. Everyone gets dizzy.
Right. The principal psychological theory is the fear of fear hypothesis. This is where the psychology of the individual takes over where the biology began. It relies heavily on a psychological trait measured by the Anxiety Sensitivity Index, or the ASI.
Exactly. High scorers on the ASI have a psychological tendency to catastrophize normal, benign bodily sensations. So let's look at the mechanical memory tool for this, which we call the vicious circle of panic. Here is how the loop accelerates.
Step 1. Biology starts a minor physical symptom. Maybe you just walked up a flight of stairs, maybe you had an extra shot of espresso, and your heart rate increases slightly. It's a normal biological event.
Step 2. Psychology misinterprets it. A person with high anxiety sensitivity feels that slight palpitation and instantly thinks, oh my God, something is wrong with my heart. I'm having a heart attack. I'm dying.
Step 3. Because of that terrifying catastrophic thought, their cognitive anxiety spikes massively.
Step 4. Because the brain is now signaling a mortal threat, the biology reacts more forcefully to match the perceived threat. Their heart beats even faster. They start sweating. Their chest tightens.
Step 5. The psychology observes this escalating physical response and sees it as undeniable confirmation. The brain says, see, the chest is tighter, I am definitely dying, and boom, the circle accelerates exponentially within seconds into a full-blown, debilitating panic attack.
But I have to push back here. Wait, so people are literally terrified of their own biological machinery. Has modern, comfortable society demonized physical discomfort to the point that we panic at the sensation of a normal heartbeat?
Well, are we just completely intolerant of our own physiological processes because we are so used to existing in perfectly climate-controlled, stress-free environments?
Yeah, exactly.
That is a highly provocative way to frame it, but there is clinical truth there. Anxiety sensitivity is exactly that.
Yeah.
A profound fear of the physiological symptoms of fear. People become hypervigilant
They are constantly scanning their bodies
for any sign of arousal. A slight twitch, a skipped heartbeat, a wave of heat. And ironically, that very act of hypervigilant scanning keeps their nervous system in a constant state of baseline arousal, which actually makes a panic attack significantly more likely to occur.
I want to tie this back to the philosophical and moral connections we've been discussing because the literature mentions another extraordinary cross-cultural syndrome that perfectly mirrors this existential terror, but in a completely different context. The Inuit concept of kayak angst.
Yes, kayak angst is a phenomenon documented among traditional Inuit seal hunters in northern Canada and Greenland. These are incredibly brave, highly skilled hunters who are out alone on the vast, freezing ocean in a single-person kayak.
And suddenly, out of nowhere, they experience a sudden attack of intense fear, profound cognitive disorientation, and a terrifying, obsessive concern about drowning.
Think about the philosophical context of that situation. You are surrounded by immense, crushing isolation. You are a tiny speck on the vast, unforgiving surface of the ocean.
All of the societal safety nets, the community structures, the solid ground, everything is completely stripped away. You are forced into a raw confrontation with the sheer scale of the natural world and your own profound human vulnerability.
It triggers a deep, almost spiritual or existential terror that perfectly mirrors the clinical mechanics of a Western panic attack. It's like the environment forces the ego to realize its own fragility, resulting in autonomic panic.
It is a stark, powerful reminder that panic is a fundamental human capacity, waiting beneath the surface, triggered by a complex interplay of our environment, our philosophical interpretations of safety, and our neurochemistry.
Okay, we've covered the sudden, explosive hurricanes of specific phobias and panic attacks. Now let's transition to a different kind of storm.
If a panic attack is a violent hurricane, generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, is like a perpetual low-grade drizzle that never, ever stops.
Very apt analogy. Generalized anxiety disorder is clinically defined by chronic, excessive, and uncontrollable worry about minor everyday things. It is all-encompassing and free-floating.
People with JADA aren't usually panicking about dying in the next 5 minutes. They're endlessly worrying about being late for an appointment, the exact tone of an email they sent, their health, their long-term finances, or having too much work to do next week.
And this cognitive churn is accompanied by exhausting physical symptoms. Severe chronic muscle tension, extreme irritability, and inability to concentrate, and profound sleep disruption.
The sleep disruption is a massive indicator. The primary text details the case of a 36-year-old woman who simply could not sleep because she was endlessly, obsessively worrying about getting fired from her new job and plunging her family into financial ruin.
The tragic irony was that there was absolutely zero evidence she was doing a bad job. In fact, she was highly competent. Her worry was completely unfounded in reality, but it occupied her cognitive bandwidth constantly.
And this brings us right back to the diagnostic criteria debate we touched on earlier regarding the DSM-5. Researchers ran the numbers and found that if you simply relax the diagnostic criteria for GAD, specifically by removing the single requirement that the worry must be clinically evaluated as excessive, the estimated prevalence rate in the population literally doubles overnight.
It jumps from around 6.6% to an astonishing 13.7%.
Which again highlights how incredibly hard it is to empirically define abnormal worry. Who decides what is excessive? But moving past the definition, why do people with GAD worry so much? Let's dive into the etiology.
Cognitive behavioral views point strongly to a fundamental feeling of a lack of control and unpredictability in the universe. Central to this cognitive behavioral framework is the concept of intolerance of uncertainty.
For people with GAD, ambiguous situations are not just annoying. They are perceived as inherently dangerous and deeply threatening. Let me give an example of how this plays out.
Go for it.
If you text a friend and the friend doesn't reply for 3 hours, a person without GA who can tolerate uncertainty might think, Oh, they're probably just busy at work or left their phone in the other room.
Right, a normal assumption.
A person with GAD, entirely intolerant of the uncertainty, will instantly spiral into catastrophic ideation. They read it and ignored it. They hate me. I did something offensive last week. Our friendship is permanently over.
And this leads to what is perhaps the most fascinating theory in the entire chapter regarding the function of this worry. Borkovik's theory of worry. You have to ask a logical question. Why would anyone unconsciously choose to worry all the time? Worry is exhausting. It feels terrible.
Borkovec proposes a radical idea that worry is actually negatively reinforcing.
Explain how that works. How can feeling terrible be reinforcing?
Because worrying is primarily a linguistic, verbal, left brain activity. You are talking to yourself in your head about minor things like what to make for dinner or if you paid the electric bill.
Borkovic theorized that by constantly engaging in this low-level verbal worry, the brain successfully distracts itself from processing deeper, vastly more painful emotional imagery and the severe physiological autonomic arousal associated with trauma or profound existential lack of control.
It's a cognitive avoidance strategy. You endlessly worry about the trivial electric bill so you don't have to visualize or feel the deep, raw, physiological terror of your own underlying emotional pain. It's a linguistic shield against trauma.
That is brilliant. And biologically, we see the physical counterpart to this malfunctioning system. We see severe deficits in the GABA system in individuals with GD.
GABA is gamma-aminobutyric acid. It is the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. It functions exactly like the anti-lock braking system, the ABS in your car.
If your brain's neurons start firing rapid anxiety signals, GABA is supposed to flood across the synaptic clefts and hit the brakes, calming the system down and returning you to baseline.
In individuals with GBD, the ABS brakes are faulty. The neural firing of anxiety begins, but the GABA system fails to inhibit it, so the anxiety just keeps skidding forward indefinitely.
We also see this biological hypervigilance proved in modern eye tracking studies. Researchers place participants in front of screens and use software to track the exact micro movements of their pupils.
When shown a grid of various photos, the eye-tracking software proves that people with GD immediately, almost instinctively within milliseconds, fixate their gaze on threat cues, like an angry face, while ignoring neutral or happy faces. They literally perceive the visual world differently.
So they are biologically primed to see threats and biologically deficient in the brakes required to calm down.
Here's my analogy for GD. Imagine your brain is a computer and you have 50 tabs open on your internet browser.
Oh, I hate that already.
Right. And every single tab is autoplaying a different, highly stressful 24-hour news broadcast at full volume at the same time. And you are frantically clicking around the screen, but you cannot find the mute button for any of them.
That overwhelming, inescapable noise is the chronic hum of GAD.
That is a terrifyingly relatable analogy for the cognitive load they carry. And there is one final crucial cognitive piece to GAD that ties perfectly into our theme of morality and philosophy. It is the concept of metacognitive beliefs about worry.
Right. Meta, meaning thinking about thinking. People with GAD don't just worry. They have complex beliefs about their own worry. And often, they hold extremely positive metacognitive beliefs about it.
They believe on a deep moral level that worrying is actually a good ethical thing to do.
They rationalize it morally. Their internal narrative dictates, going makes me a responsible adult. If I stay awake worrying about my family's safety, it proves that I love them. If I obsessively worry about the future, I am magically preventing bad things from happening.
They feel a moral obligation to worry, and because they believe worrying serves a protective, ethical, and loving function, they are completely trapped in the disorder.
They cannot allow themselves to let go of the worry, because to them, letting go would be morally irresponsible, selfish, and dangerous. It's an impenetrable psychological trap.
Okay, we have thoroughly diagnosed the problems. We've mapped the mechanical PCB circuit. We've gone through the evolutionary phobias, the self versus group terror of SAD and TKS, the biological panic injection of CCK4, and the 50 open tabs of GAD.
Now, we must look at how to fix it. How do we rewire the anxious brain? Let's start with behavioral therapies.
The absolute cornerstone of behavioral treatment for anxiety is exposure. You have to face the fear to extinguish it. Historically, clinicians started with systematic desensitization.
This involved teaching the client deep muscle relaxation techniques and then having them simply imagine the fearful scenes like imagining looking at a spider while staying relaxed.
But clinical evidence over the decades quickly showed that in vivo exposure, meaning literal, real-life physical exposure to the phobic object, is vastly superior in creating lasting neural changes.
But there is a massive, fascinating physiological exception to this rule of exposure and relaxation, and it involves the blood injection injury phobias we discussed earlier.
Oh, right, the B and B Saner?
If you try to use traditional relaxation techniques like deep breathing and muscle relaxing while exposing someone with a needle phobia to a syringe, you will actually cause a medical event.
Why? Because this specific phobia triggers a highly unique biphasic physiological response orchestrated by the vagus nerve. First, when they see the needle, their heart rate spikes violently.
But then, almost immediately, their blood pressure suddenly and dramatically plummets, resulting in vasovagal syncope. They faint dead away. If you tell a patient to relax their muscles as the blood pressure is dropping, it accelerates the drop and they pass out even faster.
So the behavioral treatment is the exact opposite of traditional anxiety therapy. They are taught a technique called applied tension.
They're instructed to intentionally, aggressively tense the major muscle groups in their arms, legs, and chest to artificially spike and maintain their blood pressure, physically preventing the fainting response while they are exposed to the needle.
It's so counterintuitive but mechanically brilliant. We are also seeing a huge revolutionary rise in virtual reality, or VR, and augmented reality exposure therapies.
Think about the logistics. If someone is terrified of flying, traditional in vivo exposure requires buying a plane ticket, navigating airport security, and flying with a therapist. It is insanely expensive and impractical.
But with VR, they can put on a high-definition headset and simulate the exact visual and auditory environment of a turbulent flight right in the clinic.
The textbook even detailed a study where a person used a touch-sensitive haptic feedback device so they could physically feel the sensation of crushing virtual spiders with their hand.
Moving from the behavioral to the cognitive therapies, the therapeutic focus shifts from just facing the fear to actively changing the underlying catastrophic beliefs.
For social anxiety disorder, David Clark, whose cognitive model we discussed earlier, advocates for behavioral experiments rather than just plain exposure. He calls this process widening the bandwidth.
A therapist might instruct a highly socially anxious client to intentionally act in a way they deeply believe is socially unacceptable and catastrophic, like purposely spilling a cup of water at a restaurant, or intentionally dropping their index cards while giving a speech.
The goal is for the client to objectively observe the results. They drop the cards, and instead of the audience laughing and destroying their reputation, people either ignore it or offer to help.
The experiment physically proves to their brain that the world is not as punitive and critical as their disorder made them believe.
And for panic disorder, we have the intensely effective panic control therapy. This utilizes a technique called interoceptive exposure. Honestly, it sounds like absolute torture to the patient at first, but it breaks the cycle.
The therapist intentionally and safely triggers the exact physical symptoms of a full-blown panic attack right there in the safety of the clinical office.
They will literally have the client breathe heavily through a tiny coffee straw for 2 minutes to simulate the terrifying feeling of shortness of breath and suffocation. Or they will put the client in a specialized office chair and spin them rapidly to induce severe, disorienting dizziness.
The clinical goal is to force the physical symptoms to occur and then prove to the client, look, you feel dizzy, your heart is racing at 150 beats per minute, you feel like you can't breathe, but you are not dying. It is just a biological sensation. You are completely safe.
It systematically shatters that vicious circle of panic we talked about earlier.
Finally, we must look at biological therapies and psychopharmacology. Benzodiazepines, like Valium and Ativan, are frequently used because they artificially enhance that GABA inhibitory system we mentioned earlier. They force the neural brakes to engage.
SSRIs, which are traditionally antidepressants, are actually the first-line preferred medication for SAD, GAD, and panic disorder because they alter the serotonin baseline without the severe addiction risks of benzos.
But we must acknowledge the massive, tragic issue of individuals self-medicating with alcohol, particularly those with SA and GAD, leading to severe, life-threatening substance abuse comorbidities.
But here is the most futuristic, sci-fi biological intervention in the literature right now. The use of a drug called D-cycloserine, or DCS.
DCS is not an anti-anxiety drug. It does not calm you down. It is a drug that specifically targets the NMDA receptors in the brain, which are responsible for learning and fear-related memory reconsolidation.
You take a pill of DCS 1 to 2 hours before you go into a terrifying exposure therapy session. It essentially supercharges the brain's neuroplasticity, enhancing its ability to learn fear extinction.
It physically makes the exposure therapy stick better in the long-term memory architecture.
It is groundbreaking, but it comes with a massive, dangerous caveat. Hoffman published a critical research paper on this titled, Making Good Exposures Better and Bad Exposures Worse.
Because DCS acts as a memory enhancer, if the exposure session goes poorly, meaning if the patient panics, ends the session early and escapes, thereby reinforcing the fear, the DCS will actually cement that failure and terror into their memory architecture even harder.
It enhances memory reconsolidation universally, for better or for much worse.
So what does this all mean? We have all these tools exposure, cognitive experiments, memory-enhancing drugs, but I have to ask the big philosophical question here. Is it right to just drug away anxiety?
If anxiety is a biological smoke alarm, signaling that something in a person's environment or their lifestyle or their underlying psychological foundation is deeply wrong, aren't we just popping the battery out of the smoke alarm while the house burns down?
That is the exact potent critique leveled by many psychological paradigms against pure psychopharmacology. Holland's extensive research concluded that cognitive behavioral therapy creates lasting structural neurological change by fundamentally altering how a person's brain appraises threats.
Drugs, on the other hand, are often merely palliative. They treat the biological symptom. But the moment you stop taking the drug, the anxiety returns with a vengeance, because the underlying cognitive distortion or environmental chaos was never actually resolved.
Psychoanalytic therapies make the exact same philosophical argument. Treating only the surface symptom ignores the deep, underlying conflict causing the pain.
Which brings us to the newest and arguably most profound wave of psychological treatment: mindfulness and acceptance-based approaches. Instead of fighting the anxiety, or drugging it into submission, or aggressively challenging and arguing with the thoughts, you learn to observe them objectively through a cognitive process called decentering.
And this ties back perfectly to our theme of morality and altruism. The literature highlights an incredible study from researchers in British Columbia who utilized loving-kindness meditation to treat severe social anxiety disorder.
They went far beyond just accepting negative thoughts. They designed an intervention where one group of highly socially anxious students were instructed to perform intentional, specific acts of kindness toward other people in their community.
And the clinical results were absolutely staggering. The students who were outperforming moral acts of kindness had significantly greater reductions in their desire to avoid social situations than the students who only participated in traditional self-focused exposure therapy.
Think about the mechanics of that. Healing through moral action. By decentering from their own fragile egos, by focusing their cognitive bandwidth on bringing joy and relief to others, the intense self-focused terror of social anxiety disorder simply dissolved.
It is a beautiful synthesis of psychology and morality. It is a profound clinical realization that sometimes the ultimate cure for our own internal psychological suffering is turning our attention outward in service to others.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a truly monumental amount of material today. Let's do a quick wrap-up summary for our study buddy listening in so you have the mental framework locked in for your finals.
We systematically unpacked the PCB circuit of anxiety: physiological autonomic arousal, cognitive catastrophic worry, and behavioral avoidance. We memorized the B-SANO categories for specific phobias, driven by evolutionary prepared learning.
We explored the deep, self-focused fear of judgment in social anxiety disorder and contrasted it with the altruistic moral fear of Taijin Kyofusho in Japan.
We looked at the terrifying fear of fear biological loop in panic disorder, driven by the locus coeruleus and the amygdala, and the chronic 50 tabs open low-grade hum of generalized anxiety disorder, fueled by an intolerance of uncertainty and faulty GABA brakes.
And finally, we looked at how in vivo exposure, cognitive behavioral experiments, and even acts of loving kindness can physically rewire those anxious neural pathways.
And to our listener, the third study buddy in the room with us, remember the story of Kate Waddingham that we started with at the top of the session? Anxiety disorders are incredibly prevalent.
You are not an anomaly if you experience this. They are the most common psychological disorders in the human population.
But they are also highly structurally treatable. Seeking clinical help is not a sign of moral weakness or deficiency. It is the ultimate sign of psychological bravery.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive session of the Psychology Undergrad.
But before we sign off, this raises an important question. We have spent the last hour meticulously discussing how to eradicate, treat, and medicate anxiety. But given that some baseline level of anxiety is biologically hardwired into us by evolution to keep us alive, and culturally hardwired into us by our morals to keep us connected and responsible to our communities.
At what point does striving for a completely stress-free, perfectly calm life become a clinical pathology of its own? Are we losing our tolerance for simply being human?
Think about that medical x-ray machine we use to look at broken bones. It's binary. The bone is broken or it is not. But the anxious human mind is murky, complex, and deeply sensitive to the world.
Maybe the ultimate goal isn't to dismantle the smoke alarm so it never rings again.
Maybe the true goal of psychology is simply learning the wisdom to tell the difference between a burnt piece of toast and a house on fire.